It gives me great pleasure to present the Congregational Heritage Award to St Michael Lutheran Church in Irmo, South Carolina. And I want to just highlight a few of the reasons why we chose to honor this congregation at this time. They have a very honorable and variegated history that fits nicely with the Unsung project that you heard about earlier. What you may not know is that we did the filming for much of the portion of the South Carolina Synod in the documentary at St. Michael, where we interviewed people and did oral history back in March. St. Michael was organized in 1814, and I may miss some dates because I find contradictions in the material that I went through. So if I miss a date, Dr. McCarver, that's why, because it's not always clear. But as I pieced this together from various sources, originally St. Michael was admitted into the North Carolina Synod because that was the only synod around at that time. And I'm going to skip ahead and try not to steal your thunder, but 10 years later, under the leadership of Pastor, I'm going to forget his name, Dreher, but I'm trying to remember, Godfrey. Pastor Godfrey Dreher petitioned the North Carolina Synod to allow congregations in South Carolina and adjacent states to form their own synod. And this was done amicably. And the synod had its first assembly, they didn't call them those in those days, they called it a convention, at St. Michael. And they had two in 1824 rather. In January of 1824, they met to organize and form the South Carolina Synod, and they elected Pastor Godfrey Dreher as the first Synod president. Now, I'm puzzled over that because everything I saw in the minutes had John Bachman as Synod president. And I found out that what happened is the Synod met again in October of 1814 and elected a new president, John Bachman, and then elected Pastor Godfrey Dreher as treasurer of the Synod, and he served in that role until 1835. And at that point, the Synod decided they wanted lay people to be Synod treasurer. I don't know why they did that, but that was the decision of the Synod. In 1816, and this is noteworthy historically, the North Carolina Synod decided, remember, St. Michael was still in North Carolina at that point, the North Carolina Synod decided to have some kind of a special conference, and it was held at St. Michael. And that was the first ecclesiastical assembly of its sort for Lutherans in South Carolina. So St. Michael was the site of the organization of the Synod. It was also the site of the first ecclesiastical Lutheran gathering in the state of South Carolina. They went on to host Synod assemblies in 1826, 1857, and 1924. Now, part of what we're interested in the history of St. Michael is that they were one of the congregations that, in many ways, was a leader in reaching out to African Americans in the first half of the 19th century. And again, Pastor Anderson Frank can correct me on the numbers, but I understand there were as many as maybe 200 African Americans, most of whom I think were enslaved people, who worshiped in the gallery of St. Michael Church. Now, it's not there now because there have been three buildings. They started with an old schoolhouse, a one-room schoolhouse, but very quickly built a new church building, still in 1814. But that building had a gallery, and that's where the African Americans worshiped until well after the Civil War, right up until the end of Reconstruction. So that's a history that many of us don't know a great deal about. And that's why we're into this research about the unsung stories of African Americans all across the South. And what happened at St. Michael is not isolated, I found out. There were many congregations across South Carolina and North Carolina and in Georgia where there was an outreach to African Americans, and that was something I knew nothing about until I started doing some of this research that I've been doing. So I've told you about the organization of the congregation. I've told you about the organization and founding of the South Carolina Synod, all of which are associated with St. Michael. Across the years, the congregation has added to its buildings. They built the current church building in 1921, And since that time, they've had several remodelings and renovations, both externally and internally. The original church, now here's where we get conflicting reports. The original church, built in 1814, was known as the Blue Church. Now, according to one record, that's because the church was painted blue on the exterior. Interesting. According to other reports, and this is the one that's in the history book, it's because the church had a blue ceiling. Now, what I understand from reading these various sources is that the church was blue originally, but then it was painted white somewhere around 1880. And when they painted the church white, they painted the ceiling inside blue. And so then it still continued to be known as the Old Blue Church. And then in 1921, they built the current facility, which, as I said, has gone through a number of remodelings. They've also added to their buildings. They built an educational building in 1954. They built a new parsonage in 1950. And that was an interesting development because prior to that time, St. Michael was part of a parish. And the parish came to an end in 1950, and they built a parsonage. They had one earlier, but they sold it in 1923. So there was no parsonage until 1950 that was exclusively for St. Michael. But they built the parsonage, interestingly enough, on the site where the original one-room schoolhouse had been located. That schoolhouse is still there. And I know that Pastor Anderson has some plans for that, to commemorate that heritage. Then in 1988 and 89, the congregation built a new fellowship hall, kitchen, 6 Sunday school classrooms, and a 2,500 square foot basement, which, if you haven't seen it, is a marvelous facility to see. Now, I can't tell you all of the improvements, that would go on too long, but this will give you an idea of some of the highlights of the history of that congregation. I understand that we have with us tonight a number of members of the church council from St. Michael, and I'd like to ask you if you would stand to be recognized. I also want to recognize Pastor Mary Anderson, who is a direct descendant of Pastor Godfrey Dreyer. She says he was a great, 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 great uncle. And last but not least, to receive the award on behalf of St. Michael is Pastor Frank Anderson.
We'll let you get back to Dean. All right. Thank you so much, Harvey. It's a live night. As is always the case, there are some little corrections to your presentation. The funny thing about St. Michael, and I am so honored to be a part of this congregation. It's the congregation that Mary's family founded in 1813. And interestingly enough, the families that came to St. Michael were from Zion Lutheran and Bethel Lutheran. Bethel was under the lake now. They wanted to worship in English. There was a political fervor or patriotic fervor going on because of the War of 1812, and they wanted to worship in English, but neither Zion nor Bethel would allow them to worship in the sanctuary at their church. And so they started meeting at the schoolhouse, Pleasant Spring Schoolhouse there. The 1816 meeting was held in German. The meeting was deliberated in German, but those who wanted to hear it in English sat outside the building with the windows open so that they could hear the translation of what was being transacted inside the building. So just some very funny stories about all that. The 1921 sanctuary that you'll see in the photos here is virtually original. There's been no additions or changes for the most part to that building, and we were just recognized from the National Register of Historic Places designation, and so we now have that, and we are just about to put up a historical marker on River Road that tells the story of the congregation, including the Blue Church. When I came to work at St. Michael, probably the first time I actually interacted with the congregation in a big way was for their bicentennial in 2014. And I found 11 church histories. 11 church histories from various pastors and different people. We are very blessed that we have copies of all of the records starting in 1813 and going all the way until the current time. What's interesting about that is that John Dreher, who's Godfrey Dreher's father, was very, very interested in evangelizing the enslaved community. Unfortunately, that did not extend to free blacks or freed blacks after the Civil War. But there was this enthusiasm for sort of reaching out to those enslaved African Americans. And the story has sort of a sad ending for St. Michael, and that is that, of course, 1865 is the end of the war, 1863 is emancipation. The African Americans continued to worship at St. Michael until 1876. And at that time, within weeks of the federal troops leaving South Carolina, the Congregation Council, and they noted it in their minutes, they scribed this, that having no further use of the building at St. Michael's, the African Americans were expelled in order to form their own church. And I think that was probably a pretty typical story for that time. So we have really enjoyed at St. Michael's exploring our history and really sort of cherishing it, but we are not satisfied with just talking about our history. We are really looking at becoming a community church, a public church. We share our building with the community. We have a wonderful campus there, and we have a lot of property where people come and walk their dogs and sit and meditate and all of that. Outreach to AA and also yearly concerts and all. We're just doing everything we can to bring people into the congregation or into the church. And even if they never join the congregation, we feel as though that is our obligation to be good hosts to the community. And so that is one of the things that St. Michael has really embraced along with me since I came there in 2018. So I'm really blessed because I tell you, these folks that are here with us today, I think we have 14 folks from St. Michael. Very rarely, if I come up with some harebrained idea, do they say, "No, Pastor, we just don't feel like that's the right thing for us." They are always very enthusiastic about coming up with ways to support the ministry that we do. So, this is really a wonderful award. We have a beautiful archive that we've been working on, and if you ever want to see some really cool things, we have the list of colored members from 1842 that has about 80 members listed, and interestingly, they're listed by first name and who they belong to. And so it's sort of chilling to see some of these documents and to see what's going on. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have another Dreher descendant, Kathy Dreher, who's here, who is also a grandchild of John Dreher. And I want to just say one last thing about John Dreher, because he was a dedicated churchman, a layman. His two sons, Godfrey and Daniel, both studied for the ministry. Godfrey was ordained. Daniel was licensed, but then died at the age of 32 and was never ordained. But John Dreher was one of the wealthy planters in that area, and he funded tracts and books and all sorts of things for the South Carolina Synod to use in their evangelistic efforts. And he did that joyfully from everything that we can see. He was really, really dedicated to spreading the gospel. And I think the separation from North Carolina Synod was only possible because between 1814 and 1824, John Dreher had his son Godfrey Dreher founding congregations left and right all over the place. And so the first meetings of the congregations there were historical congregations from before 1800, and then the congregations that Godfrey Dreher had helped find. So just a wonderful history, and thank you so much for recognizing us. This is Dean White Cotton, our president of council, and we're just honored to be here. Thank you so much.